In the past, if we were talking about electronic media, we would be talking almost exclusively about broadcast and radio. And now we've certainly seen a great evolution of that with the web, with the Web 2.0. But we're going to look at the foundation of the law as it relates to broadcast, as it originated with the idea of moving pictures and transmittable sound. And then we're going to see how it's evolved since then. So, broadcast regulations are similar to other aspects of media, but to be honest, they are one of the only areas in America where licensure is required for journalism. So understanding why broadcast media is different and why the web has certainly changed our understanding of broadcast is pretty significant to understanding how we've evolved through the media landscape. Every broadcast station has to have what's called an FCC license, the Federal Communication Commission, and you have to actually prove that you have the right criteria in order to be an owner of one of these licenses. You need to be an American citizen or a company that's not controlled by foreign interests. You have to be of, and I put in quotes, good character by their determination, and you have to prove your technical and financial ability. So this is what allows people to have a broadcast station like ABC, NBC, CBS, TBS, those things that you see on the network airwaves. Now, there are limits to what types and amounts of media that you can own. These are set by the FCC. So, for example, in one metropolitan area, you can own 5 to 8 radio stations. You can have a TV station that reaches 39% of the country's TV households. You can have 2 stations in the same community if no more than one of them is among the 4 highest rated in the city, and at least 8 independently owned commercial or non-commercial stations exist in the community. Radio station licenses can make that have their own newspaper and a TV station, and you'll notice that that applies to the Columbus Dispatch, which owns 10 TV and the Columbus Dispatch. It also owns 97.1 The Fan, a variety of other media enterprises. At least 8 major media voices need to exist. One company cannot own more than one of the top 4 broadcast networks. So that would be ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox. The Communications Act of 1934 is what established the Federal Communication Commission, and its goal was to license these airwaves. So, think about the evolution of radio and television was happening, moving into the 1930s. It was considered to be a distribution tool with incredible penetration into communities, and so the public interest required that it needed to be regulated in some way. So the court, by analyzing these different aspects of media, has determined that each mass media has basic free speech, but not all of them are the same. And because broadcast uses what is basically a publicly owned distribution tool, this actual electromagnetic field, and there's restrictions on how many stations can exist in a certain geographic area, that it was the government's responsibility to make sure that it was fair and equitable and that it was serving the community the best way that it could. As the broadcast airwaves continued to evolve, legislation had to continue to evolve with it. And so in 1949, we were faced with the Fairness Doctrine, which was established by the Federal Communication Commission, requiring radio and TV broadcasters basically to present a balanced and fair discussion of public issues on the airwaves. This included all kinds of views about controversies that were considered to be of public importance. And it was actually challenged about 20 years later, in 1968, in the Red Lion Broadcasting Company versus the FCC case. So the idea with this case, the FCC's Fairness Doctrine, was the 2 primary requirements that it had to focus on in this case dealt with personal attacks in the context of public issues debate and the idea of political editorializing. And Red Lion challenged the application of the Fairness Doctrine in regards to a broadcast that it had aired that it was determined to be in violation. Now, the question before the court was whether or not the Fairness Doctrine violated First Amendment freedom of speech guarantees as it concerned this idea of limiting personal attacks made in the context of a public issues debate. And the court ruled no, that the Fairness Doctrine was consistent with the First Amendment, and it brought up this idea again about spectrum scarcity. And the quote by Byron White was that idle to posit an unabridgable First Amendment right to broadcast comparable to the right of every individual to speak, write, or publish. So because this is a limited resource, there needs to be limitations on it. And they felt that this idea of the fairness doctrine enhanced rather than infringed on freedom of speech. Now, that hasn't been the case in recent years. In 1987, it actually was decided that the fairness doctrine did violate First Amendment rights, and when it expired in 1989, it wasn't renewed, and actually it was officially eliminated in 2011. The next big issue that kind of pushed broadcast into its next sphere of existence was deregulation. So in the 1980s, the FCC decided to let the market, rather than the commission, regulate how many stations would be owned, who would own them, a lot of the regulations that were initially set up. And it eliminated a lot of program requirements in terms of commercial time limits. As we noted, it eliminated the fairness doctrine. It established program and advertising regulations, so although it can set kind of general programming rules, we started to see this evolution in terms of what was on broadcast TV, when was going to be allowed. We had Section 315 was established, which provided, we used to have this idea of equal time for political candidates, where if you gave time to one, you had to give time to the other. Section 315 set up that you now needed to provide equal opportunity for legally qualified candidates as opposed to equal time. So in the case of, we also looked at the creation of what we call Section 315. In the past, we had a regulation that required that there be equal opportunity for two political candidates to have equal time on a broadcast sphere. Now, Section 315 actually established that now they need to have equal opportunity for access, not actually equal time. So in the case of two or more legally qualified candidates vying for the same office, if one uses broadcast, the other has to be given the equal opportunity at a comparable rate. So, we've noticed a lot of tit-for-tat advertising in relation to this particular section. Now, there are 4 exceptions to use. So in terms of Section 315, you do not need to provide equal access in a news program. So something like 60 Minutes, if they did a piece on one candidate, they don't have to require that the other candidate have access at that time. Regularly scheduled interviews, so something like Meet the Press, or even something like Jerry Springer, if it's regularly scheduled, then there doesn't have to be equal time on there, which is why, you've seen the Obamas on The View, as is pictured here, and at the time there wasn't a requirement that Mitt Romney, for example, get equal access to that. If there's live coverage of a news event, so in the event that the president is speaking, or something's happening in your community and your legislator gets access on the broadcast media, his opponent does not have to have opportunity to get the same. And when there's a documentary, which of course became a pretty significant scandal in the fall of 2013, when CNN was looking to do a documentary on Hillary Clinton in advance of her potential run for the presidency, and the Republicans were really upset about that. Now, there are other restrictions and regulations that the federal government has put on to broadcast, some of which you may see all the time and not even realize. Certainly children's programming. There's a requirement that there be programming on that would meet educational informational needs. 3 hours a week, averaging over 6 months, programs of at least 30 minutes. The idea that children's programming should exist between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. And the advertising is actually limited to 12 minutes per hour during the week and 10.5 minutes on the weekend. You're not really supposed to do hoaxes, and we've had a few of them that have inspired the government to speak out against this. There was a fraudulent emergency signal in 1912, false distress signal in 1934, and then, of course, in 1938 we had War of the Worlds, where Orson Welles put on a radio show that aliens had invaded New Jersey, caused mildly widespread panic. It's certainly been kind of dramatized over time, but the fact remains is that if people hear things through what they consider to be standard broadcast medium, and it appears to be something that it's not, that could cause panic, that's not what this medium is intended for. There's actually a requirement when you hear a sponsorship ID that broadcasters have to disclose when they're paid to air material. So that came out of the 1950s, actually, and then a law passed in the 1960s. It was something called payola, and the payola scandal was radio stations were being paid by recording companies to play music, and that's how music was getting played. And of course, at that time, there was no other way to hear music, so music would drive sales, and so this was considered to be a pretty big scandal. There was an anti-payola law that was passed in the 1960s. Truthfully, it hasn't really stopped this altogether, but it has been curtailed, certainly below the level that it was. Now, cable TV, when it came on board, it's a whole different animal than broadcast. It's not transmitted through the spectrum of this idea of the broadcast spectrum. It's transmitted through cable. So it still has to be licensed. I mean, there's still franchise fees, and you may notice that when, for example, CBS had a problem with Time Warner, and so the CBS shows did not appear on Time Warner because of this licensing fee that if you don't pay it, that's a problem. So I'm curious, and I'd like to talk with you a little bit about what some of the other challenges are, differences that you see between cable TV and broadcast TV. So I can tell you that cable programming has a must-carry and transmission rule. It requires that there be local programming for some portion of the broadcasting that's done. They can negotiate with local stations in terms of retransmission consent. We also have similar access issues, public and educational and government access as per the 1984 Cable Communication Policy Act, and that allows local citizens to put on programming. So you'll notice on, I can't think of a cable network that you wouldn't see. Often it's like Channel 2 or Channel 3 where we allow local citizens to put on programming. We also have a non-duplication clause in here, which will delete programming on distant stations that are carried by cable. This often applies to the big four networks, and a lot of times it comes into play with sports. When we have a sports blackout, it's because of this restriction. So here's just some of the key concepts I want you to think about. We are going to get into one of the most significant legal issues related to broadcast, and that, of course, is the transmission of material that we may not want everybody to see. So that's what we're going to talk about next.